Good morning. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth from the mouth of God. Words are important because of the ideas that they represent and convey to us. And probably one of the most important words in the entire dictionary is the word freedom, because of the idea that the word freedom conveys to us, or should convey to us. You can understand the importance of freedom itself when you stop to think that for many centuries BC, we have the recorded history of peoples seeking freedom. The Hebrews seeking freedom from Pharaoh, the Hebrews seeking freedom from Caesar, the Hebrews seeking freedom from Russia and Poland, and later from Hitler. But Hebrews haven't been the only ones seeking freedom. One of the first of the great free nations of the world was Greece, where the idea of freedom thrived, where people embraced within themselves an idea and an ideal of freedom and then struggled to attain it. In our present day, freedom has been one of the most used words in all languages, because the people of Africa and of India, of Asia, of Europe, all have been seeking freedom. You realize, of course, that no one ever attains it. And if they seem to attain it for a short time, they lose it again. Probably if the word freedom were better understood, we would have a greater opportunity of attaining it and retaining it. Because evidently, those who have sought freedom, and even those who for a while thought they attained it, must have been mistaken in their concept of freedom, in the meaning of freedom. And if freedom is ever to be attained, it will have to be on some other basis than that which we have heretofore known. One thing is certain: all attempts to attain freedom by force must fail, because freedom, like the kingdom of God, cannot be taken by storm. It cannot be taken by might or by power. The reason is that freedom is a spiritual quality. It isn't a physical condition, and that has been the mistake of the ages, believing that freedom is a physical condition and that you can become free from somebody or free from something. And in this false concept of freedom lies the tragedy of all of the ages. Freedom is a spiritual quality. And freedom must be spiritually obtained, spiritually realized, spiritually demonstrated. Freedom is never from something or from somebody. Freedom is a condition within ourselves, within the consciousness of individual or collective man. Freedom may be obtained by an individual while all others are in slavery. An outstanding example of this is Moses, who at no time was a slave under Pharaoh. Jesus, who was at no time a slave under either Caesar or the Sanhedrin. Freedom is attained within the consciousness of an individual or within the consciousness of the race. But it is never a freedom from anything or from anyone. It is really, if you can use the word from, it is really a freedom from ignorance, and primarily from spiritual ignorance, because where there is spiritual enlightenment, there is no bondage, there is no slavery. Do not think for a moment that I'm speaking at this moment merely of the type of slavery that may be experienced under some government or form of government. I'm speaking of freedom as a word representing an idea. Because mankind, even in the free countries, is in bondage. They're in bondage to beliefs, concepts, theories, which hold them in a vise and from which they never can be released until they understand the nature of freedom. One thing that in this present age is enslaving everybody is the subject of money. Everyone is in slavery to that belief that money is power. And with a sufficiency of it, there would be a release from bondage. How foolish this idea is when you stop to think of the amount of gold and the amount of silver and the amount of currency there is in the world, and those who possess it and who are finding no freedom with it. It was in the papers just the other day that the freest and greatest currencies of today are those of Germany and of Japan. You'd hardly call these free countries, or that the people are free just because of this great abundance of wealth. In some ways, this country of ours, in the United States, is one of the richest, and certainly our people have by far the greatest incomes individually and collectively of any nation on the earth. And reading our papers, you will agree that we are not free. We are in bondage right now to the fear of extermination. We are in bondage to the fear of inflation. We are in bondage to the fear of the next depression. We are in bondage to the fear of labor troubles. We're in bondage to so many different things that it is laughable to think of ourselves as actually being free. Most communities, we're afraid to drive a car on the road. Now, freedom cannot be attained by an abundance of money. Freedom cannot be obtained by a constitution that guarantees you freedom. We have such a constitution. Do I have to tell you on how many different subjects we are not free? Freedom cannot be obtained externally, and freedom cannot be obtained from anything. Freedom will be attained individually and collectively as we understand the spiritual nature of our being. Do you know that in any moment in which you can realize that I and my Father are one, in any moment that you can bring to recollection, Son, thou art ever with me, and all that I have is thine, you begin to be free of economic lack, because the only bondage there is the belief that we are bound by the limitations of sums of money or sums of property. No one is free by the amount of their possessions, but by the freedom that comes to them through the realization of their identity. If you are children of God, you are heirs of God and joint heir to all. Therefore, the only freedom that can be obtained, freedom from lack or limitation, would be in the freedom that is attained by virtue of your understanding of your relationship to your source. I and my source are one. I and my Father are one, and I am heir to my Father's estate, allness. The human side of that freedom soon begins to make itself apparent when we release ourselves from bondage to the belief that money, securities, or property would set us free. In the same way, in our human relationships, we can never get free from each other. Wives will never get free from husbands, and husbands will never get free from wives, not even with all the divorce laws in the country. This doesn't bring freedom. We still have that wife and we still have that husband in consciousness and sometimes on the payroll. There is no external freedom. The freedom in marital relationships comes when we set our partner free, not when we attain freedom from them, but when they obtain freedom from us. When we realize that as I and my Father are one and that this is my eternal relationship, that our mate also is one with God and free in God. not bound to man-made laws, rules, and restrictions, but free to live under God's rule, God's grace, God's law, not man's, God's. We have this in the business world, where if you speak to the industrialist, he can prove to you that he is in slavery to his workers. And equally, you can be convinced by the workers that they are in slavery to the industrialists. But really and truly, that slavery only exists as a mental concept only because of this bondage to the belief that man whose breath is in his nostril is a power. Only because we do not realize our relationship to our source. The workers will never be free of the industrialist or the industrialist from the worker until they set each other free. This is not a wild theory. This is spiritual law that has already been demonstrated by some of our great industrialists who themselves have been free and who have freed their employees. And their institutions prove what can be done when one individual in a company, one in sufficient authority, realizes the nature of man and sets him free and is thereby set free. There is no greater spiritual law than this, that we only attain the freedom we give. There is really only one God. And God is universal being. God is the God of you and the God of me. God is the life of you and the life of me. And when the Master reveals that, inasmuch as ye have done it unto the least of these my brethren, ye have done it unto me, or inasmuch as ye have not done it unto the least of these my brethren, ye have not done it unto me, he is revealing this spiritual law, that since there is only one self, one being, one life, the freedom that I give to another is being given unto me. And the freedom that I do not give another is being withheld from me. Freedom, then, is a quality of your own consciousness, and you must open out a way for that imprisoned splendor to escape. It is exactly like the subject of love, or the subject of friendship, or the subject of companionship. You have read in the writings that there are many people seeking metaphysically to demonstrate companionship. So they believe, and it isn't true. They aren't seeking that at all. They are merely seeking companions, or a companion. And it's far different from seeking companionship. To seek companionship means to express it, not to look for it to come from outer space or from someone else. We are not responsible for someone else's life or demonstration, but for our own. And if we were seeking companionship, the only way to attain it would be to give it, to seek some way of expressing companionship. There is no way to find love in this world. The only way to experience love is to express it. There is no way to find philanthropy in the world unless we call these miserable handouts philanthropy. Benevolence is something that must be expressed from within our own being. It is for this reason that these subjects, like the subject of freedom, can never be understood until we understand the nature of our own being and of our own identity, and then give up this searching for freedom, searching for companionship, searching for love, and begin to realize that as an heir of God, all that the Father hath is mine, and now how can I open out a way for this imprisoned splendor to escape? What am I holding in bondage? Or who am I holding in bondage, and to what extent, or how? And to what extent and in what way can I give freedom? Can I release? The Master voiced it in forgiving 70 times 7. He voiced it in praying for our enemies. In other words, release. Release this world. Coming into the higher consciousness of the mystical kingdom, where you find the Master saying, my kingdom is not of this world, my way is not your way, you begin to realize that the first freedom that has to be given by us is a freedom to God. We have to free God. We have all been holding God in bondage. We've all been holding God tightly within our grasp so that he doesn't get away from us and doesn't forget his duty to us and his obligation to us. We are always holding tightly. Loose him and let him go. God does not have to be reminded of his function in life. God does not have to be held down and watched. When we release God and no longer hold God in that bondage to ourselves, no longer expect God to be taking us as favored individuals or a favored nation into freedom, harmony, abundance. When we release God to be the law of freedom unto this entire universe, we have started to come out of slavery, out of bondage. We have started to come into freedom, because now at least we are free of the nonsensical belief that we have to be running around holding on to God in order to bring some benefits into our experience. Oh, you'll be surprised what a release and relief and freedom and joy will come into your life when you release God and really trust God to be God without our supervision. Oh yes, we supervise God every single day of the week. Indeed we do. Try to guide him and lead him into the paths in which we would go, if not instructing him how best to bring it about. But probably that is too much to expect of us at one jump. We can start closer at hand within our family circle, and try to review within our own thoughts to what extent we are acting as limitation to members of our family, to what extent we are holding them in bondage to our beliefs of what a husband or wife or child or aunt or uncle or cousin should be. The freedom isn't from our relatives. The freedom is the freedom that's attained within ourselves. And this gives them their freedom, and the freedom that we give to them returns unto us. In the world today, this whole idea of freedom fills the pages of every paper and magazine that's printed. Freedom. Probably at first hearing, you won't believe this, but do you know that the world is seeking freedom from a country with which it is allied and recently fought a war to get freedom from someone else? Do you not realize that it's only a short time ago that we were allies of the great democratic Christian nation of Russia in seeking to overthrow the undemocratic and unchristian nation of Germany? You feel a little bit ridiculous when you stop to think that in some ways even now we are allied with Russia, while at the same time seeking freedom from them. Do you believe we are in bondage to them? Do you believe that we ever could be? Do you believe really and truly that anyone can ever enslave us except insofar as we permit it? Are we not masters of our fate? Are we not heirs of God? Do we not have jurisdiction over our lives by the grace of God? Are we not servants of God? And if we are, how could we ever become servants of man, or slaves of man, or slaves of a system? These things can only creep up upon us by our own consent, and the only way we give our consent is by ignoring our relationship with God. Our freedom must be spiritually attained, spiritually realized, spiritually maintained, and then nothing can enter that defileth or maketh a lie. Nothing can enter from without. No powers external to us can operate in our consciousness or upon our lives except by our ignorance of spiritual truth, spiritual identity, and the fact that freedom isn't a physical thing, it's a spiritual entity. Now, be assured of this. If you hold freedom to be something of a physical nature that can be given to you or taken from you, so will it be unto you, in accordance with your faith. But in that moment, when you realize only by the grace of God do we have freedom, only by the grace of God do we have God's government, and that this is not at the mercy of man whose breath is in his nostril, that this cannot be given to us by princes nor taken from us by kings or potentates. Only by the realization of the spiritual nature of freedom can we attain it and maintain it. Freedom isn't something you go out and fight for. The nations of the world have been going out and fighting for it since time began. And now, 7,000 years later, they're fighting for it on a wider scale than ever before, and there are fewer free places on earth than probably ever in history. I'm not a pacifist. I'm not trying to get the government to give up whatever mode or means it sees fit and the people of the country see fit. I'm talking now about first individual freedom, and then the freedom that we can bring to the world that it itself never can bring. But not until we individually, just as one individual who attains some measure of freedom from the belief that disease is power or that disease has a law, is enabled to be a law of freedom from disease unto others. So does anyone who attains some measure of freedom from lack and limitation become the law of freedom unto others. So in this wider sense, those who attain the realization of the spiritual nature of freedom and begin to perceive that temporal power cannot touch it, they first attain their own freedom and then help to establish that freedom for the entire world. It will be found that knowing the truth will enable the truth to make us free. Nothing else will make us free but knowing the truth. And the truth is that freedom is spiritual, and that freedom cannot be taken from you. But please believe that first of all you must understand that freedom is something that cannot be given to you. Stop looking to somebody to give you your freedom, and be very watchful in your own thought to what extent you are holding someone else in bondage, because the bondage that you are holding another in is the extent of the bondage that is holding you. As we learn to release God in the realization that without holding fast to God, without anxiety and concern, the sun will come up in the morning and go down in the evening. The tides will come in and they will go out. The stars will move in their courses. The crops will grow. And like will beget like. The potatoes will still produce potatoes, and orchids will still produce orchids because of a law that can never be broken. And so it is that your harmony, your peace, your abundance, your safety, your security, these are assured because of a spiritual grace, a spiritual law. My peace no man taketh from me, it is said. The Master cautioned about the sword. Put up thy sword, resist not evil, agree with thine adversary. You know, to accept the Christian teachings and not understand these passages means really not to accept them. You cannot accept what you do not understand. And so you must understand that the entire revelation of the Master is that God is the only power. Spiritual power is the only power, not temporal power. It is on this point that all freedom hinges. If you are going to give power to temporal power, then this philosophical jackass who is teaching rather red than dead would be true. What difference would it make whether Russia enslaved you this year or Hitler last year or somebody bobs up next year, the year after? But it isn't true that we must suffer slavery to avoid death. There is no such alternative in this world. The alternative is know the truth or be enslaved. Because then if it isn't an outside slavery, it'll be one of your own mentality. Something within yourself, some ignorance that will be enslaving you, or a false appetite. All forms of slavery aren't external. There are lots of internal ones. And all limitation is within ourselves. There is no limitation external to us. You ought to see that now by this travel in space, that the only limitations are those that have been imposed upon us by widespread beliefs, just as before 1492 it was impossible to travel the seas. Why? There were no barriers out there, but there were the limitations of human knowledge. And this kept them within bounds so that no ship would go out of sight of land. So it is that there was no telegraph, no telephone. We were limited to conversations within hearing distance or correspondence within the limitations of communication. But these limitations did not exist in time and space. They existed only in the minds of men. And the moment the mind of man could expand, we no longer had those limitations. And we had round-the-world conversations and round-the-world messages and so forth and so on. Limitation is due to ignorance. And limitation is a form of bondage. And bondage is due to ignorance. Slavery is due to ignorance. And it is the ignorance of this one point. Since freedom is spiritual, it is not at the mercy of matter. Since freedom is a God-given quality, it is not at the mercy of man. Freedom must be realized in consciousness, and then freedom will be expressed in daily life. You already know that there are some people living very comfortably free of most of the diseases of the world. You already know that there are individuals who are living free of economic fears. Not because of the abundance of dollars that they have, but because of their spiritual realization of the nature of abundance. The Master was free of economic limitation, and yet he had no storehouses or bonds. stop in this very hour. Stop believing that someone or something can hold you in bondage. Stop believing even that there is an ideology that can somehow embrace you and enslave you. Bondage is a self-imposed limitation due to the acceptance of a universal ignorance. Freedom is attained through knowing the truth. When you demonstrate the first real experience of freedom from something or someone whom you believe has held you in bondage, you will then be on the road to helping others attain their freedom. If there could be a formula to help us, it would be this: I and my Father are one. Now try to hold my Father in bondage. And I and my Father are one, not two. Where I am, my Father is. Where my Father is, I am, for we are one and not two. I am not mortal or material, but spiritual. I am not visible, but invisible. Once we begin to perceive, even in a measure, that freedom is spiritual, it's the gift of God, the grace of God, a quality of God that is embodied in our own consciousness, and stop fearing. Stop fearing temporal power, stop fearing persons, and realize that it is your relationship with God that constitutes your freedom, and you will demonstrate it. But while doing this, review in your own mind to what extent you may be holding others in bondage and begin to set them free. For in setting them free, you are setting yourself free, because inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of these, the least of these, my brethren, ye have done it unto me. This truth, maintained in our consciousness, becomes a law of freedom unto all those upon whom our thought rests. In the degree that we are constantly setting free everyone in this world, releasing them into God, and thereby releasing ourselves into our original relationship as children of God, one with God, in that degree we are setting those free who may be our neighbors, sometimes near neighbors and sometimes far neighbors, because there is no limitation to the extent of our consciousness. Our consciousness is not confined to this room. It is not confined to our bodies, and it is not confined to this room. Our consciousness is not even confined to this nation. And this we prove in the degree of healing work that takes place when we are helping students and patients in Africa or India, anywhere in the Orient or Europe, and then find that the consciousness of truth that we are realizing here in this room is operating as a law of healing on continents and islands far, far away. The reason is that this entire universe is embraced in consciousness. And since there is only one consciousness, the whole universe is embraced in your consciousness and mine. And therefore, what we set free in our consciousness is freed. And what we hold in bondage in our consciousness is not only held in bondage, but is also holding us in bondage. Make it a daily practice to set this world free, including God. Go ahead, God, be about your business. You take care of your business, and I'll be taking care of that which you give me to do. And then to our friends and to our relatives, be ye free. I hold you in no obligation to me. Anything that I may do for you is done only as an act of grace from God through me to you. And I realize that you can do no more for me than the grace of God, understood, permits. But I hold you in no bondage, because my sufficiency is of God. Thy grace, God, thy grace, Father, is my sufficiency. Therefore, I am not holding my family or my friends, my students or my patients in bondage to me. I loose you and set you free in God. I release you to God's care, even as I am now released within myself in the spiritual truth that I and my Father are one, and you and your Father are one. I owe you nothing except to love you. You owe me nothing except to love me in your own way, not according to my standards. In your own way, to whatever degree the grace of God gives it to you. Whatever I do is not from a sense of duty or legal relationship, but from a sense that I am my brother's keeper, that I owe it to every man to express the love of God. And this alone is the reason for my actions. And I expect nothing other than that of you. And so it is that as we set God free, so that we understand that God owes nothing to us, God owes only to God, and God is forever fulfilling God's obligation to himself. We need not remind God of that. God is the all-knowing, infinite wisdom and love. We need to remind ourselves, however, that we live by the grace of God, and the grace of God is my sufficiency, and we need therefore hold no man in bondage to us or under obligation to us. Even if they owe us money, let's forgive it, so that we absolutely have the freedom to receive our grace from God, not from man whose breath is in his nostril. Then can you not see that this is a life of freedom? And the reason it is a life of freedom is it's a life lived in God, through God, by God's grace. And who can take that from us? On our coins we say, in God we trust. And you know we don't. But let it be true in the experience of one who shall become a majority with God. Let it be true in the two or more who are gathered together in thy name. Let it be true in the 10 righteous men in a city, and watch how the entire city is saved. Let it be true that a few individuals lose their fear of man whose breath is in his nostril and of all his temporal power, and realizes his life in God, and then see how this will externalize itself as some divine idea in the mind of some president or premier, prime minister, somebody or other in the right place that will bring forth freedom and liberty. Don't accept for a moment that this world is facing either extermination or slavery. Don't believe for a moment that it is facing war or surrender. Those are not the alternatives. This world is facing only one thing: a release from fear through the understanding of God's grace and God's freedom and God's life. This world is really facing a need for 10 righteous men, or 2 or more gathered together, or 1 who shall be a majority. The only need this world has is for the few who will really save the world through their understanding that we are not facing human alternatives, that we are not facing death or destruction, that as a matter of fact, temporal power isn't power, and the freedom doesn't come through temporal power, but through God's grace. In thy presence is fullness of joy, fullness of life. In thy presence. Only in the realization that I and the Father are one do we live in that presence and experience fulfillment. But see this: good cannot come to you from outside your own being. It must come to you as an act of your own consciousness. If you would be free, and if you would help to free this world, then take these 2 or 3 minutes every hour of the day and as many hours of the night as you're awake to realize that where I am, God is, and that means omnipresence. To realize that freedom is a spiritual quality, not at the mercy of man or temporal powers. Consciously know this truth, and you'll be surprised how widely you are broadcasting it, because what the Father seeth in secret, he rewardeth openly. Everything that takes place in your consciousness in silence and secrecy is broadcast to all receptive consciousness throughout the world. You need not pray openly or publicly. You need not make your affirmations of truth to be seen of men. Be assured of this: there is more power in a 10 seconds of realization that takes place silently and secretly within you than in 10 hours of talking or outwardly praying. There is only one reason that I take an hour here to say these things to you. There is no power in my hour of speech The power is in your acceptance of this within your consciousness and then abiding in it as I do. A moment or two, a minute or two of every hour, realizing thy grace no man takes from me. That which God hath joined together, no man can put asunder, and God has given me my freedom. I have freedom only by God's grace. There are no good-hearted individuals in the world that want to give it to us. Freedom is by God's grace. But this truth consciously realized as prayer, silent prayer, secret prayer, but everything that takes place of a spiritual nature in your consciousness is broadcast onto this entire world. And just those moments of prayer, of the realization of the non-power of the external world, will awaken somebody, will reveal a truth in the consciousness of somebody, Washington or London or Paris or Bonn, Moscow, somewhere. And there'll be an awakening and a realization. Why do you think the Master said that? My words will never pass away. They weren't written. They weren't broadcast. But they never have passed away. Why? A word of truth entertained in consciousness is never erased. And so it is that our silent prayer, our secret prayer, the prayer that we indulge just 1 minute at a time or less, the prayer of realization, thy grace is our freedom, and this is not at the mercy of man whose breath is in his nostril. This alone is sufficient to free the world. Truth is powerful. Truth is all power, and a secret is this: truth is the only power. But ye shall know the truth before it is power. Ye shall know the truth. Know this truth. Freedom is spiritual. Freedom is the gift of God. Freedom is omnipresent. Freedom is invisible. Freedom is never at the mercy of man or temporality. Never again should we fear a lack of freedom. We should only fear if we withhold freedom. Thank you.